And attending the 8th annual Startup Boston Week. My name is Marita and I will be your host today. And a huge thank you to Suffolk University Sawyer Business School for hosting us for the second year in a row. Suffolk University hosts a lot of great opportunities for learning, both in and outside of these classrooms. We really appreciate their partnership hosting the entirety of Startup Boston Week, both last year and this year. The goal behind Startup Boston Week is to connect the entire greater Boston area and New England community, all industries, all startup founders and departments, all bootstrapped and funding stages for 5 days of learning and connecting with one another. The team that creates Startup Boston Week is primarily volunteer, and the folks working this conference today here are volunteering their time as well. Thank you for attending the conference. It is a labor of love, and we appreciate you playing a role in shaping our startup community with us. Thank you, and I'll hand it to our panelists now. Enjoy the session.
Thank you. Yeah, in this panel today, we're going to talk about some choices that companies make on their journey to generate customer value from their data. This involves making critical decisions, especially in this AI-enabled product, with AI-enabled products that are getting so common in the world today. Questions such as how will we store and secure our data? Who can access what data? How can we scale our data infrastructure? How can we leverage our data to create more value for customers? These are hard questions, and learning from the hard-won experience of those who have been there, done that, is definitely worth it, our time. So today we're going to talk about successful data management from the perspective of senior executives. And I'm very happy to be joined today by folks right here. So let's get to it. Please join me in welcoming, let's start with Sanjay. Sanjay is an entrepreneur with 2 successful exits and a mentor and investor in multiple startups in the computer vision, cybersecurity, and software as a service space. Currently, he is the CEO of Zifino.com, a challenger in the cybersecurity space. Sanjay, if you want to share any words.
Well, I think you've said a lot already, but it's always great to come to this event because I've been coming for many, many years. Sometimes an audience, sometimes a panelist, sometimes a moderator. But I think it just shows how vibrant this ecosystem is. Myself, I'm mostly a software person and now more and more a business person. And as Braulio said, my the current company is in cybersecurity. And as you can imagine, this problem is not going to go away anytime soon. And especially with offensive attacks coming using AI, the data part becomes extremely important. So how we're using it is the data for the defensive side. Prior to that, I was founder, CEO of a computer vision company. We're just talking about facial recognition and all the other things that go with it. I'm sure we'll get into that in the panel. But, really happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. We also have with us Michelle. Michelle is an executive product leader with experience leading the product organization at high-growth VC-backed startups in health tech, data analytics, and software as a services space. Currently, she is a mentor at Venture Lane at the Startup Hub in Boston.
Hi. Let me move forward. Nice to meet everybody. First time at this conference, but done many similar panels. I've been in the data space my entire career. Started out as a data warehouse architect and developer, and so leading products in the data side is a unique challenge, both from a cost perspective, which my fellow panelists can talk a lot more about, as well as just data freshness and how to monetize it. That's probably the largest challenge. And so excited to be here and share my thoughts on what I've learned.
Wonderful. And we also have with us Thomas. Thomas is a serial entrepreneur at the forefront of information and database technology with over 15 patents. I guess this is counting, estimating down, because from the website I saw many more than
Yeah,
15.
yeah, there's a few more.
Thomas has a career in architecting and managing high-performance, distributed and real-time systems and database solutions. He is the founder and CTO of Chaos Search, the first live search SQL ML analytical database built on pure cloud object storage. Can I explain it?
Yeah, that's a mouthful. So I've done this panel before. I love the startup community, Boston startup community. I cut my teeth building God boxes back in the heyday of telecom distributed systems, but that morphed all the way into just building database technology to solve at scale. I look forward to having conversations with joining a startup community if you haven't already, or why I joined. I like hard tech, solving hard problems. And the great thing about VCs is they like to invest in such things, particularly in Boston. So love to have that conversation as well.
Wonderful. So today we're going to have a couple of rounds of questions followed by Q&A, and then we can explore the experience of these folks that sharing their time with us today. So let's begin talking about some success cases in data management. I'm going to refer to Sanjay. Yeah, Sanjay, let's start with you because you close it. So in your career, what do you consider a great achievement in transforming raw data into tangible customer value?
Wow, I wasn't expecting that, but okay. And I'm probably showing my age, but I'm sure some of you know about telcos like AT&T and all that pre-breakup. So, and I think looking out, less than half know about long distance calls. So that word doesn't exist anymore, but it was 30 cents a minute before 11 p.m. Right? So exactly, free on weekends. And so I was part of, undergrad was at electronics and computer science at MIT, but graduate work was with the speech group at the MIT Media Lab. And Sun Microsystems did servers, never did towers. And this particular machine was a tower, and they were just experimenting, and audio cards were very new. So I didn't want to pay long distance calls, charges to AT&T. So I connected the mic of one card in Mountain View to the speaker of a similar card at the Media Lab office, and vice versa. And it's now called Voice over IP, but this is 1988. And I thought, wow, someone has paid the data networks, well, MIT had and Sun had, and I got to make a free call that never needed to end. So that became the reason I brought Internet Nepal, all of that. And of course, calling Nepal was $3 a minute, right? So I never called home. So there are times in the life cycle of technology and all that where you look at how the data is flowing, and then you say, maybe there's a way to arbitrage. Maybe there's a way to do something better. I mean, I'll tell you, it was completely selfishness on my part. I just did not want to pay 30 cents a minute or $3 a minute, right? And so, but it's all about data. And so what I want to impart here is that if you're observant, you can see how the data is moving and who's making the money. And as entrepreneurs, our job is to mitigate risk and maximize arbitrage. So that's sort of, it's a little bit not exactly your question, but I thought it's a good story that to start off this panel.
Good. Well, I guess I want to add with another perspective, Michelle. In your career, same question. In your career, what do you consider a great achievement in transforming raw data into tangible customer value?
Oh, wow. So I started in data warehousing when, most of the reports were like 80% of all data warehouses fail. And really figuring out, I think there was this idea that the data had value, but nobody had any idea about how to get value. I mean, sales data was obvious early on, but how to collect it, how to store it, how to organize it, how to leverage it. And I got the opportunity fairly early on in my career to work at one of the leaders in the data warehouse space, which was Capital One. And I used to say, like, if Capital One could know, I happen to work in their auto division, so their auto loans. And if they could know, like, the color shirt you wore when you went to go buy your car, they would want to know, because they would send you their mailers with that color on it because they felt like you might be able to spend more money. But they did a very interesting thing where they were leveraging more data points. Like, at the time, most credit companies were just looking at the score and trying to sort of guesstimate what credit risk you were. And what they did is they used like over 100 of the data points from the different credit companies. And what they were really trying to figure out is the sweet spot, not the people with the best credit and not the people that would default, but those people that they could charge a higher credit rating to, because at the time they were a subprime lender that would most likely not default. And so the loss risk models we had were the furthest years that existed back at the time. They were doing 10 plus years of loan servicing data. They had template. And by the way, we were storing all of this in Microsoft SQL servers at the time. And if you know anything about those now, you'd know that nobody uses those. So that was before even Netezza appliances. That was like so long ago. And we were using DTS as our ETL tool, which should tell you something as well. And so to be moving that kind of data, the challenges we would deal with is like, oh, can we get 10 years of loan servicing data recalculated overnight? Because we had new loans coming in every day and new data coming in every day. And could we run it in that, 8-hour span overnight and figuring out how to make optimized performance for that. So that was, back in the day when these people were really trying to, sort of do something new in the industry that hadn't been done. And I sort of referred to this as sort of two sides to the coin, which is like operational data versus monetizable data. So, and this was sort of like in that hybrid in between. They weren't monetizing it to their customer, but they were leveraging really operational data to figure out how to push the envelope of making more money, how to maximize that revenue, how to get that sort of sweet spot of the customers that they were after. And so it was a super fun time. This would have been like late 90s, early 2000s. That was a good time to be in that industry. And my husband is a front end developer. We used to argue back then whether application layer would win or data would win. I think I can lay the claim that data has won, but he would still argue with me today, but it's all right. He's wrong. But that was, I think, some of the earliest where we were really leveraging raw data to truly make decisions for the business. And I think it was an exciting time at the time.
Interesting. Let's look at these two experiences with a little bit more depth. Perhaps my idea here is exploring successful or strategic decisions in data management. So what factors in these businesses' data management practices enabled them to succeed in these initiatives? Perhaps these are a bit old examples, the technology, the decision that you made back then, not as relevant today, or maybe they are.
Well, I think it's, so perfect example is actually the credit score data, right? Nowadays, Experian, TransUnion, they offer almost every data point through really high-speed APIs. There's absolutely no reason to store all that data right now. And with the speeds, sort of what they're capable now, unlike 1988 when you were like, what? So, we no longer have dial-up modem speeds. We no longer have, things that really would cause those kind of slowdowns. So I would say, like, in today's world, I don't know that Capital One would even store that data, but that's, data sort of has this life cycle where it's become so ubiquitous that it's everywhere, and storing it doesn't necessarily doesn't add value to the decision-making process. So really I think that's where some of the trade-offs come in. We're looking at the cost of storage and processing and how it's leveraged versus differentiated data, and thinking through, like, how do I store the derivative works of that data and not necessarily the underlying, like, all of the data that exists.
For my example, I think the transmission of data mattered, right? So everyone knew about fax, G3 fax. It's an image. An image is heavy. And my view was, why should you be sending fax if all of that is text? And so if it basically became 1/10, 1/100th the amount, and the dial-up speed, it mattered, right? So that's just the technology part. But how it translated into the business side of things is, and again, some of you may not even know what fax is, but back in the day, a lot of people use fax, and in Nepal and places like that, a page of fax was $1, which is a lot of money over there. And who used it? Well, travel agents use it like crazy. It was their workhorse. So if you go to them and say, hey, you don't need to send an image, send the text version of it, and the benefit to you is that it's going to be 1/10 the cost. They'll say, all right, I want to switch now. 1/10 is always going to win, right? So they, of course, all switched. And the following year, I heard from Nepal Telecom people, or from the grapevine, hey, what happened to that line item called fax revenue? It fell off the cliff. Well, we happened, right? So the ISP happened. So again, there's data and types of data, and heavy data is not always, beneficial. Similarly, I'm sure we'll get into this later on, but now I'm more and more doing things like creating AI models and all that. And the thinking, of course, is the bigger the model, the better. The more training data, the better. Not always so. So we'll get into that when Braulio directs us in that direction.
I'll be the contrarian. If you remove information, you lose insights. And so that fax, although smaller, maybe from security perspective, there was part of that image that had some value, right? Maybe it was a signature, maybe it was something else. And so I've always had a viewpoint that if storing information was free, you should. If it's secure, it's okay. Now, whether it's free, whether it's secure, that's a different question. But as you mentioned, AI, now data is getting more value because there are insights between the words, right? There's meaning and understanding. So particularly security, a company like ours, Chaos Search, we provide search capabilities, SQL, aka the analysis of, and ML or AI. And if you lose something, you lose a critical insight, whether it's a month, a year, 10 years. And so a lot of times you don't know what you don't know until after the fact. So be careful when you throw it away. If it's free to store and it's secure to store, again, security is a whole different thing. Assuming it's free, assuming it's secure. I have a viewpoint that storing the data has value, both from security, observability, as well as an analysis, predictive analysis. And then now with AI, you could help derive more value out of it. So I know, we can talk about different sides of it. We take the viewpoint, and our customers take the viewpoint, they store everything, because we find out time and time again that whether security reasons or future value reasons, it does show. It doesn't mean you didn't see it early, there's not value there. It just, you didn't figure it out. And so again, if it's free, if it's cost effective, if it's secure, it may be a good idea to, I guess, hoard to harvest. Huh?
Both. Well, just exploring more on this, your experience with Chaos Search. You founded a company like 6-7 years ago. I wanted to explore, like, how has the demand for data management solutions evolved since you began?
Oh yeah, I mean, we all know this. Data is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and services are creating more and more data. There's a gray line now between log and event data and business analytic data, now with AI as well. And so what I've seen is first is like, oh, monitor your operations. How is it healthy? Is it keeping you up? Is it secure? Now that data has user data in it, has application data in it. And so there's this unique ability of developers to create tons of events, doing tons of things that, machine generate data, like Library of Congress, right? It's like 20 terabytes of data, those books, nothing. We deal with 500 terabytes per day of just machine generated data from one customer. I mean, machine generated data is huge, and it's now rich with context. And so what I've seen just when we started, in my mind's eye in 2016, 2017, data is getting bigger, and companies and customers want access to that. Now we find that the companies we provide service to, their customers want access to the data, and not like 30 days and then I don't know about it. They want 90 days. They want a year of information. Before, it was cost prohibitive. The reason why we get in telecom, we got to bill monthly because that's all they could store, right, from a cost perspective. Now you want to see all that throughout life. And so the big change is just the scale and the richness of the data that's being generated.
I find, and it's interesting, the one thing I'll caveat to that is I think the maturity of the organization has a lot to do with that. I find, and I've spent about 15 years now as product head in startups, and I find that a lot of startups will store this data and have no idea how to use it. And it's always like the thing that they think of last, right? Which for somebody that's the head of product is a little bit horrifying, because one of the things that I struggle with, and this is like, I'll say this to companies and it makes so much sense to them, like when I'm talking to them about how to improve even their product practices, which is like tying your sales data with your usage data has a direct correlation to churn activity. Like that's like a straight beeline, right? How many times the users are logging in, how they're using it, what their adoption rate is, what they're leveraging is going to be a direct tie to the ARR that you have at risk, right? And so getting companies to understand that don't just pay for Pendo and it sits over there and then somebody looks at a dashboard every so often, but how it relates to the rest of your operational data within the organization is important. Like it makes sense to what,
Tommy.
Thank you, Tommy. What Thomas was just saying, sorry, is that it, like, if you're storing it anyway, if you have access to it, not leveraging it, not getting the insights out of it can cost the business quite a bit. But you do have to invest in the organization that's going to do that. You have to hire the bodies to get the insights, to make sure it's getting processed, to make sure it's getting leveraged. If you're not doing that, then it is just an empty cost. Like if you're not leveraging those things, then you might as well not even store the data. I hate to say it.
Let me double click on that because it's important. A lot of times these use cases are separate siloed solutions. And we at Chaos have a viewpoint that if you can unify it, you've unified the data, and it's hard to ETL through all these systems, particularly at scale. And so with the data lake philosophy and multiple use cases coming out with multiple APIs, it's easier to store a lot and to analyze it across, where before you had this silo solution that did this, that solution do that. And it's really hard for the teams to even communicate, let alone transfer the data.
And it's still that way. Like you have your RevOps org that owns Salesforce, right? Like it's mine, go away. And then you have your product org that owns Pendo, and they're like, it's mine, go away. And then you're like, if you could just like, if all the ops organizations could just talk to one another, be like way better. And I think that's where you start to see like, and I've worked for companies like Cognizant, obviously they monetize data itself, which is, contact data, but there's a lot of operational data that also needs investing in. And so sometimes being able to understand that how important it is and how it can actually change the decision making within your organizations, which features you build, where you double down, what you're like. If your organization is trying to go after the enterprise segment and you have no idea what features your enterprise users are using because you're not tying your usage data over here to your sales data, how can you make decisions? You just can't, right? And so thinking through these things to make sure your data lakes work, to make sure that your data makes sense as an organization, even operationally, is just super critical.
And the big warehousing companies are adding features to move closer to observability, security, or vice versa. Those companies are moving closer to BI and AI. So even the product companies are trying to unify this world.
Good. So, Michelle, you talked about your experience at Cognizant.
Mhm.
There you led a company providing sales intelligence to over 1,000 revenue teams worldwide. What were the challenges you faced in monetizing data while ensuring data quality and compliance across different regions?
So they were particularly interesting. So the one thing about contact data is freshness. That's always going to be, I think that's about all data. Like, who's got the latest, greatest, especially in the land of data sales or sales data. I think the added challenges is Cognizant is a UK company. We're primarily selling in EMEA. So you have a lot of PII, you have a lot of regulatory things that you have to deal with, and then added on to the GDPR compliance. So the one thing that Thomas was saying, like, if it's secure, there are times, depending on where you're selling, especially in GDPR land, whether you're the processor or whether you're the owner or whether you like, all of these carry different stipulations and regulations for what kind of data you're allowed to have and how you have to treat the data. So that, I think, presents its own set of challenges, especially for the monetizable side. And then what processes you have to put around it. So notification, ensuring people are opted in, ensuring sort of that you're following certain policy. In the US, for good or for bad, we're like a passive opt-in. So if you don't want people to have your data, you actually have to go and tell them, remove my data, versus like other countries like Germany, you have to get their permission to say, like, can we have your data before you can actually display it or show it. So that's probably the largest challenge, and then freshness. The other one is at some point, especially in contact data, it's everywhere, right? So purchasing it, everybody gets their data from about the same place. So then figuring out how to collect data in a way that hasn't been collected before, which is always an interesting challenge. And making sure that you're doing it in a way that is above board. There's a lot of companies that do collect data in ways that aren't above board. And I would say, like, as you guys know, Amazon used to record for 15 seconds at a time. Google magically would trace you wherever you go with your phone, right? So there's been historically, not necessarily the greatest practices out there. So I think that's always a challenge, which is how do you collect data in a way that's ethical and that doesn't alienate people? And then obviously storing it and figuring out which ones are right.
Good. Sanjay, I want to bring this discussion to you. So you, in the past, you founded Wicked. It's a facial authentication product, right? Given the sensitive nature of biometric data, how did you approach data privacy and compliance concerns for this product?
Yeah, so Wicket, which was founded in 2018, was basically, the idea was, if you remember, in 2017, Apple allowed you to use your face to open your device. So again, going back to the late 80s and early 90s, I thought, well, speech recognition and synthesis just didn't work because not enough compute, right? Or computers too expensive. But when Apple demonstrated that in 2017, I thought, oh, there's enough compute there to recognize someone's face. So maybe it's now time, or rather, compute is cheap enough that why just open your device with your face? Why not do access control, open a locked door? with opt-in, with just your face, nothing else. No key card, no phone, no QR code, nothing. Same with entry into sensitive areas like concerts, ballparks, airports. So again, by opt-in, right? So a lot of my two other principals in the company, they felt, why don't we go talk to law enforcement? And my view was, that's now a security company. You don't always get opt-in. You're just looking for bad folks, bad faces. And I thought the TAM, total addressable market, for opted-in FR, facial recognition, and I also changed the narrative a little bit by saying it's not facial recognition, it's facial authentication, which means we are determining who this person is by what they've already given us, their selfie by choice. So I'll tell you, in 2018 to right after the pandemic, more than half, let's say it was an hour-long meeting, more than half the time would be dedicated to how are you going to protect my data? How can I be sure that that selfie doesn't find its way elsewhere? All of that, right? A lot of things around privacy sensitivities, which I totally understood. Second half, so 2022 onwards, for some reason, people were more comfortable with it. Now they wanted to know, how is it going to be operationalized? If I'm the New York Mets, what happens? What is the workflow? What does the fans do? What happens when they show up at the gate? What happens? Where are the edge devices? And of course, we used, just to make it easy, we used iPads, because iPad is a big screen. It has enough compute. We could put about 1 million identities per iPad. Of course, you're in a US football game, there are 1 million entrants per evening, right? So we're way above what was needed. And then this is one of the most critical pieces. You have landmarks on your face, and there we had hundreds of them. We converted each landmark to a long vector, right? So now you're not a face, you're a long vector. And there are about, as I said, up to 1 million vectors per iPad. And so it never happened, but we planned for the potential situation that the iPad would be nicked. So if it did get nicked, you got 1 million numbers. Good luck to you going from the vectors to faces. So those are kinds of data security and data privacy type things that we had to do. And unless you, again, need to know basis, right? So unless you had the right authority, even our own people, the company employees, could not see people's faces. So we did not, move faces around. But let's say you're the admin at the customer. Unfortunately, humans cannot deal with vectors, right? They still need to come back to images. So that's how we minimized the PII part that got moved around. The part that was particularly vexing was, and I'm sure many of you know about this, Illinois has BIPA. So BIPA is extremely, draconian. So even if you were a vendor, and there's a classic, case law here where a vendor of, I think it's a California company, it's a time clock, right? So you check clock in, clock out. So instead of doing this thing with a piece of paper, it's your face. And because that clock was being used in Illinois, any Illinois resident can say, well, they never asked for my permission, so therefore I want to sue this clock company out of California. So BIPA has been used like that. I mean, you can also look it up. Meta has settled out of court and all that because of BIPA. There's COPA in California, but mostly for younger children. So you want to basically be very, very cognizant, and GDPR, of course, like Michelle said, you want to be very cognizant of these difficulties. But net, if you ask someone, do you like waiting for a concert in high heels for 3 hours? The answer is almost always no, right? Do you want to be waiting, 10 minutes at security? No, right? So almost always what we found is, and this is why the narrative shifted, I think, in the second half of my 5-year time running Wicked, convenience almost always wins out. It appears. So as long as end users feel comfortable that you're sensitive and you're very protective of their PII, they're willing to give you the selfie by choice.
Actually, I want to add the convenience, whether it's ChatGPT or sharing passwords, in your organization, or hopefully you start a company, you got to set down the law on how you share information with an organization, because it's so convenient to share this or share that particular passwords or what have you. So there are techniques, there are procedures, but people will choose convenience, whether they're giving out data or they're sharing their data that they shouldn't.
Interesting. Sanjay, I wanted to double click maybe on a more technical aspect, kind of in your data management practices that were necessary to run the Wicked product like appropriately, effectively. What were like a couple of you had to make?
Yeah, good. Well, good question. That brings us back to how much do you store? So we had our CV PhDs, computer vision experts. If you ask them, they always want to store, always, everything, all the time. Why? Because they say, even we don't know what we don't know, and we want exactly what, as Thomas said, you should have met these folks. So exactly as he said, because I don't know what I may need. And unlike many of the other computer vision companies or facial recognition companies back in 2018-19 timeframe, you could have gotten the CV models from academia or from public domain and tweak it. One of the most important decisions we made early on was, no, we'll create our own model from scratch. What that means is it's going to take a lot longer. You need a lot of training data. And we even started with employee data, and we had opt-in things and all that. So live data is almost more valuable than images, right? And having more is, of course, useful. But having video data means that now you have, if it's 64 frames a second, you have 64 images, right, rather than just one static, right? So some of the key decisions were have our own model, have our own training data, start with real video rather than static. And then the other piece was, so when we started going to professional sporting teams, they felt the fans were their customers. And we didn't want to fight about it. Because if we said they were the end customers, the users were our customers, it would not progress, right? And we're a 27-person company, and we needed to win early customers and so forth. So we said, fine, they're yours. So again, in the GDPR nomenclature, it's almost like they're the operator, we just have access and all that. So that was fine by us. But to the customers, the end users, what was very important is that once they gave us a selfie, not only could they get access in quickly, and by the way, our detection was 200 milliseconds, which basically means there's no queue. Why is there a queue? There's a queue because there's someone scanning your QR code or whatever, and in the very last moment, you're ahead of the line, and your Wi-Fi gives out, and there are all these people. So this is called service time. As service time grows, the queue lengthens. If service time is very, very low, like sub 1 second, and we're at 200 milliseconds, there is no line. And so what happened was that, we asked in the product, are you okay if we could improve the product with your own data as you're entering? That became the most valuable data in the long run, right? It was opted in. We could demonstrate that, with the timestamp and all that, when they opted in. And they could opt out anytime, by the way. You could say, well, I went to the Mets game and I'm not going there ever again. Get me out. We'd remove them immediately. And so people like Thomas would not be happy. But but also by default, we kept that data, even though it was landmark vectors, we kept only for a year. Because there's sort of a, if we, and again, I've had to be in so many meetings with general counsels of some very, very large companies, which I cannot mention here. And their view is you will have a breach and our large company is going to bear the largest liability. So that's their point of view. So if we say, we got the opt-in, we're going to keep this forever, the general counsel is going to strike us down, right? So that's why we were very much careful as to how to move the ball forward, but at the same time not run afoul of privacy issues, general counsel issues, and all that. So again, we're all entrepreneurs, right? You want to do practical things. You want to mitigate risks, but still move the ball forward.
And actually, I like, because I don't store the data. Our customers store the data that they want. So those people, I'll store it if they want it. I'll get rid of it if they want it. But we have seen this time and time again. Sometimes they put data into a log or event. They didn't mean to, and they call us up and like wipe everything that you have. It's really on their system, but it's so easy to get the wrong information into the system. And there's all these procedures. So when you start your company, hire a SOC 2 expert, hire people that are pros on this, that your engineering team, your customer success team, your leadership all know what it means. Make sure you have general counsel all the time, because these things do come up. And don't store private data if you don't have to.
Wonderful. Guess this is about time that we open up for questions from the audience. Please, who was the first there in the back? Yeah.
Hello. Oh, hi. Amazing stories, I think, from all three of you. I'm just trying to kind of sum it up in my head in respect to the title and everything like that. So is the consensus that yes, build, yes, hoard, yes, harvest, and as long as you're doing it responsibly? And if so, the one thing that I'm missing a little bit, because I heard Michelle talk about Pendo, and obviously Thomas is working on chaos search. But when you build, when you hoard, is the consensus to build something out from scratch, or to use a collection of tools like Pendo, like BigQuery, and just chuck everything in there and figure it out later?
I'll start. So one of my key premises was that the customer owns everything, and we create an abstraction layer to allow them to leverage their data. So that's point one. If you store data with somebody else, then they own your data. Our customers own their data. We just optimize it to do it at scale and ease of use. You can't harvest if you don't hoard, right? And that's by definition. So the question is, how much do you hoard, so that how much can you harvest? And so we can always say that hoarding is bad, but if you don't store something, you can't harvest it. So I think it's a fine line between just enough, but not too much and get yourself in trouble. But there's no easy answer. You may think you went through 25 years of a successful startup and you got no security breaches and you stored enough. And then the next day, someone does something wrong that's only a day old of data. And now you're thinking, why don't we store it for a second or a nanosecond, right? And so I don't know if there's a right answer. You just have to be aware, wise, and make the best decision you can at the time, but knowing and always knowing that there is risk all the time. And it's not if you'll get breached, it's when, and take that to heart.
And I would sort of add to something that Thomas said, which was the knowing how long. So first of all, I can't think of any of the companies that I worked for recently, short of data that we were like truly monetizing, or the tools that we were using weren't SaaS tools. So they are sitting somewhere, right? The data is originated usually in different systems. It's how do you get the data out to leverage it together? Now, that being said, thinking about usage data, this is huge volumes of data, right? So if there is a pruning and a time limit on that at some point, how your customers used it a year ago may no longer be relevant, right? Features change, things change. So along with, as Thomas was saying, like, know your policies and procedures. Part of your policies should be your data retention policies for each of your systems, right? Like that, and that includes sales data, that includes usage data, that includes your financial data, that includes like across the board of all of the tools. And I think that people need to be cognizant, because they're, even though he said if it doesn't cost it, it always costs something. It always costs something to store the data. So I would just be sort of conscious of the tools that are using, and how, what's your pruning sort of for each of those tools in terms of leveraging the data.
Also, going back to what Thomas said, right? Part of the reason I said, okay, that's enough of Wicked, let's do a cyber entity, it's called Zyphino, is because people were a little bit careless with the data security part, and they'd be breached, right? And then, of course, even in the breach, is it usage data, or is it PII? Is it medical data? All of that matters. And while we're slightly desensitized to these breaches, I felt, if you look at a pyramid and the top Fortune 5,000, they have lots of capital, and they have a lot of vendors protecting them and all. But the middle market is completely unprotected. And we never hear about them in the headlines. Why? Because the demands or the incident payouts are much smaller. But it could be the end of your company. And that's why I thought, okay, now that there's so much data sloshing around, even sometimes it's just carelessness, as we know from CrowdStrike and all that, right? Sometimes just carelessness makes a lot of difficulties for everyone in the supply chain, the value chain, upstream, downstream. So I thought, okay, now that there's so much data, we got to do something with it from the cybersecurity side and protect, especially the middle market. So it's very important.
And check your vendors, right? Are they SOC 2, Type 2 compliant? How long have they been compliant? Whatever ISO.
7001.
Yeah. And so, we are so easily convenient by SaaS services, but all these breaches were typically done by bad practices. And so, I do give out my data to Google, but are they always good? I don't know. And they're a big organization.
And by the big doesn't always translate to always secure.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
they're mostly secure, and they have bigger punitive aspects to it. But yeah, that's why we do go upstream as well, because.
But you said it right. One failure could end your company. You have to tell it to your employees, to your investors. One failure could be it being over.
Yeah. Oh, we have lots of questions.
Hi, I'm curious about what you guys think about synthetic data, for instance, that clones real data for faces.
Yeah.
For instance, we've seen some papers in the domain where you have synthetic faces made out of real facial data.
Great question.
Things like that, as well as things like de-identification of textual data, for instance, and storing them or harvesting them. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll try to answer the synthetic data part. If you're not going to get opt-in from live human beings, synthetic data is the next best thing. However, what happens is, there's a vicious cycle. There are negative feedback. So your model is there. You have a handful of real data, and then you have a lot of synthetic data, right? And then that gets used to train. And so what comes out, and by the way, this is not just for images. It's also starting to happen with large language model, right? It's just a bunch of text, right? So as you may have heard, we're running out of training data for textual training data. They're using all of the internet. And so what comes out is synthetic data. Now, if that also gets pumped into the internet, and the models cannot make the distinction between what was original and what was synthetic, and all of that went back into training, more and more you're going to start getting garbage, right? I'm not talking about this week or next week. I'm talking about next year or 5 years out, you might get all garbage. Similarly with, we did use a lot of synthetic data to be within the privacy, lanes. But, as I was alluding to earlier, we got saved by real data from real customers because they opted in within our mobile app. So it's a simple answer. If you have the choice between synthetic and real data, use real data. But there are times when you need to improve your model, and synthetic data will come in very handy.
I also think the jury's out of how that synthetic data was derived. And so there's all this legal about derived data. What does it mean to have derived data? Does the model have derived information? I mean, so, things leak. One thing about large language models, they want to tell you everything. So anything that's private in there, LLMs want to tell you about it, right? So I think it's the same problem. And whether it's good data or bad data for your use case, I think that's a good question, because, as you said, solid data is solid data. But I think it holds the same risks, or potential same risks, which thus is a risk.
Hi, I guess building on that a little bit, you talk about the value of data holding it for the long term, and of course the risks of holding on to PII. I'm curious how any of you think about the possibility of store the PII for a year, or however long you really need to run the business, but then keep an anonymized copy forever so that you can do after the fact retroactive analysis. Is there value to that? How do you think about that?
I mean, absolutely, right? I mean, this is back to your I'm sorry. This is back to the policy. If you don't have to store it and you can itemize it out, do it. And so I would say that it's not a should you should.
Yeah. I mean, so I worked for a startup called Humanize. One of the things that we were doing was looking at communication data to determine information loss within companies and engagement and cohesion between teams. And one of the things that we did, and even when we stored the data, we actually hashed all of the emails. We de-anonymized everything, even to store it. But yeah, absolutely. Like, the more organizations you look at, the better the models become, and you want to leverage that long term. So there's definitely, and especially storing even just the derived data of the results of those algorithms has huge value.
Yeah, and I'll actually double down. Let's say you're an engineer company and you have a working system that data or that use case drove a bug or a behavior. How do you add that test so that you don't see it again? So early on in our company's creation was we learned and taught ourselves how to itemize data so that we could have it in a use case to be sure that we don't have this bug again. So this should be thought of at all levels, not just are you storing this data, but the software that is used to store the data needs to have that thinking as well. I don't know if that helps think it through.
Also, for medical imaging, I worked on medical imaging data for a long, long time, and there's a very, very long-standing practice of anonymizing data, right? So we all have benefited from medical imaging and other data in medical practice where it's completely anonymized. Wouldn't you want to benefit from all those millions of mammography or PT scans or whatever, right? So that's completely anonymized. There's a slightly different version which is de-identified. There's a key that de-identifies it, and if you lose that key, well, everything's visible again, right? So anonymized one way, you never get the original PII back. But I'll tell you, that is super critical, because you want the group dynamics to help each individual in that group. So anonymizing data whenever possible. Your question was, should we do it or not? Yes, absolutely do it, especially if you want to hold the data for a long time.
Great, thank you. If there's time at the end, I'm curious if you have tools to recommend for anonymizing data, but I'll pass the mic before I get into that.
Hi, Nishant here. So one of the things that's, startup pre-seed, in seed stage, they are really focusing on building their own application that, or the business they're trying to build. And at some point they want to figure out whether they want to build a data warehouse or not. So maybe Thomas, this is a question for you, because you work with a lot of companies who want to come to you to build their own data warehouses. At what point do you think startups should start thinking about using data warehousing, into their business practices? Like, when they should start engaging into this ROI, because startups are resource stripped, and this is also resource consuming activity for them to do. So when do you think you have seen startups are more successful leveraging data warehousing?
No, it's a great question. There's no perfect architecture, and you can fail to plan. And so, meaning that there are viewpoints that you start small, you start cheap, and you just re-architect as you grow. And there's other viewpoints that you plan ahead for that growth. I think either one can work. To build out a warehouse, I feel it's more about the data model and less about the provider or warehouse in general, whether it's a SQL-based solution, it's a Snowflake or BigQuery. It could be a MySQL instance on your laptop, hopefully backed up, right? So I don't think you have to choose a professional Netezza roll in the hardware massive machine to support your warehouse. But you have to know the evolution of your product, your scale, and your costs. And I've seen multiple companies change databases over time. It can be painful. Like, if you go Oracle, it's so hard to get off Oracle. No offense to Oracle. We love Oracle. But it's painful if you start choosing features that are proprietary to their solution. So as long as you can stay normalized, itemized, right, you're safe. But I don't think there's a perfect choice, but don't spend a lot of money when you're a startup, but spend enough so that you can migrate over time.
And I think also identify the sources that are going to help you make the best data or best decisions is what it comes down to. Because when you have, like I mentioned, usage data, when you have 10 users, your usage data probably isn't that critical for you to store. But there's other data that you made, like your marketing performance website, right? So how's your website performing? Are you getting the word out there? Are you getting an influx of people coming in? So because you're spending marketing dollars, you'd like to make sure your marketing dollars are earning you something back. So it's being smart about the data sources that you're choosing to start storing and building into your data warehouse.
And the really, I think, thing is, do you build it yourself? Do you export it? And if you export it to somebody else, can you import it? What's the cost of that? So once you start giving it to somebody else, understand the rules and what that might cost you.
Perfect, folks. I want to take some time at the end now to allow our panelists to share any advice they would like to share with our audience of wannabe or current entrepreneurs and leaders at early stage ventures who want to create a strong data management foundation to enables them to create value for their customers.
I'll start. I mean, obviously, this is a philosophical viewpoint. I believe in the cloud because it's going to be cost effective. I believe in lakes because it can be cost effective. There's a lot of expertise if you go down that road of using the cloud, using the lake viewpoint. However, at certain scale, at certain cost, like at JP Morgan, they start bringing it in-house. So there's no perfect solution, but I think if this is a startup community and costs and scale are small, I would say leverage cloud, leverage lake, but you might grow out of that and do something different.
Okay, Michelle wants me to go next. So becoming even more philosophical, and I know this is a data panel, but what I would say to fellow entrepreneurs and would-be entrepreneurs is, to me, entrepreneurship is very polite persistence. And, you're going to come up with all sorts of challenges, and it's not a straight line to the northeast, right? It's up and down. But, if you can stay standing for long enough, you will be successful. And it's not just for the data side, for pretty much everything. 2 companies prior, I decided, it was right after 9/11. So there was no need or there was no possibility of doing a fundraise. So I said, all right, let's let's bootstrap completely. And let's, and I was a sole founder. But at the same time, you go through 2008 and say, okay, the sky's falling. But I think whenever there are big events like that, you realize there's another day. But I'll tell you, the time right after 2008 is when we won the U.S. Navy and Anheuser-Busch, all these big names, and there's an ultimate good outcome with an exit. But in this community, what I see is a lot of folks saying, what is the safest ticket? There isn't one. It's just that you have to be polite and persistent together.
I think probably the thing I would say, especially in the early days, hiring really matters more than anything. Finding people whose values align with some of the things that we've already talked about, like people who will give thought to better practices, giving people who will give thought to operational decisions that aren't just necessarily about the build side, but also thinking about how do we store, how do we grow, how do we do that? I think that becomes super critical, especially in that employees like 1 through 10, because that will really set some of that foundation. So I would say, like, it's sometimes I think, especially in startups, you wanna invest in lower cost resources, but that's not always the best strategy, especially for growth and trajectory. So that's probably the one tidbit I'd leave with.
Wonderful. Sanjay, Nisha, and Thomas, thank you very much for your time and for sharing all of your insights. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. It was a very insightful panel. Thank you very much. So we have a lot more for today and for the rest of the week of Startup Boston Week. Just make sure that you don't miss our welcoming party tonight at 6 p.m. In the first floor. I'm sorry. And now in this room specifically, we will have the next panel called Under Lock and Key: Safeguarding Your and Your Customers' Privacy. If it's not what you're looking for, then you need to change the room. So go to the registration desk and they will help you find the place you need to be. And lastly, Kevin Thai from Three Circle Studio over here is our photography partner for Startup Boston Week. So definitely make sure when you see him and he's here to snap your photo, because then you can download your own personalized photo album of Startup Boston Week, and you can remember these days for the whole year long. More information of how that works you can find on that desk behind the seats. So yeah, thank you very much, and see you next session. Thank you very much.